Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Cherry Audio Mercury-6 tutorial series. I'm going to have a look at the internal architecture of the synth today. In other words, its voices and layer architecture. If you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's a fantastic way to do that. Over the course of this series, I've mentioned a few times that we've basically got two synths in one. We have this concept called layers, which basically creates effectively two stacked Mercury-6s. By default, the behavior is that only one of them is enabled. In the key mode section, if whole is engaged, you can see that the lower panel of two, lower and upper, is grayed out, in other words, disabled. All of these buttons are red. The red buttons belong to the upper layer, and that's the only one that you can hear. If I press the layer button, however, now the lower layer has been engaged. If I toggle over to the lower layer, you can see that all of the buttons turn to a kind of cyan blue. And now we've got full access to both of those sounds. I'm going to solo using the layer solo button, just the lower layer, so that we can hear it playing. You can see that this light's now flashing. All the buttons have stayed blue. So this is the lower layer you're hearing now. Let's make them distinct. I'm going to make the lower layer pulse mode only, and I'm going to knock its range up to 8 feet. So we've got two different oscillators, both at 8 foot, both pulse waves. I'll detune them slightly. Now I'm going to switch over to the upper layer. We're still in solo mode, so now all the lights are turned red, and now we're playing the upper layer. I'm going to make the upper layer sawtooth only. Again, slightly detune them for an extra bit of fatness. Now I'm going to activate both of those layers simultaneously, take the solo button off, and you'll hear both the sawtooth and the pulse wave layers simultaneously. That's all very well and good, but layers really come into their own when you pan them in the stereo field as well. So all of the lights are red. We're looking at the upper layer here. Everything that we can edit, we're editing the upper layer. So if I move the pan to the right hand side, not all the way, it's a little bit extreme if we go all the way, but I'll go to about 3 o'clock. Switch back over to the lower layer. Now all of the lights are blue. Pull that pan to the left. Now we'll really hear that stereo separation. Just going to bring it in a little bit. Even that's a little bit much for my taste. Subtle is good. There we go. If you're going to use dual layers, just bear in mind that anything you edit is only affecting a single layer. Just train yourself to beware. This is a great interface because the two colours are so clearly distinct. It's really obvious that you're looking at either the lower or the upper layer, but it can trip you up. Just be careful of it. So now that we've been introduced to the concept of layers, I'm going to throw a lot of that complexity away and really simplify the sound so that we can start drilling into each of these settings and really hear what's going on. I'm going to switch it back into whole mode so that I'm only using the upper layer. Just as a matter of interest, if I had the lower layer engaged and pressed whole mode, the synth automatically jumps over to the upper layer. There's no concept of the lower layer in whole mode, it's always the upper layer. I'm going to reset my tuning back to 0. So now both of the oscillators should be outputting exactly the same pitch. But when I press a note, you'll hear that they're not. You can quite clearly see in the oscilloscope as well, and see in the tuner, there's a very slight pitch variance there. That's a concept known as analog drift. Our drift control gives us a level of basically instability in the oscillator tone generation. This is to emulate, this is what analog equipment really was like. So it's not necessarily a tuning, and it is arbitrarily introducing an element of randomness to the sound, but that's where you're getting that colour from. If I turn the drift all the way down to 0, now these two oscillators genuinely are locked together. So you're hearing both VCO 1 and 2 together. See the mix at 50%. Just set my pan back to the middle as well so that everything is absolutely stable. There we go, so the tuner is now locked at exactly 65.41. Here's an interesting thing though, every time I press a key, you're going to hear exactly the same tone. Those oscillators aren't perfectly in sync as such. They're both tuned together, but they're not necessarily synced. I can prove that quite easily. I'm going to do it using pulse waves because it's an easier demonstration tool. Hear that tone? Every time I press this C, you're going to hear exactly the same tone. What I'm going to do now is detune oscillator 2. Obviously, they're now out of tune with each other, but I'm going to reset the tuning back to 0. And now we have a different tone to the one that we played last time. So both of those oscillators are generating the same pitch consistently, but they're not necessarily perfectly in phase. And by resetting the tuning, I'll detune it again, let them go out, and then bring them back together. Now, that's the pitch you're going to hear every time. So basically the synthesizer remembers the phase of each of these oscillators, and it is locked until something knocks them out of sync again. This means that it is possible to inadvertently almost be completely out of phase. Let's see if I can catch it. I'll set the tuning up a little bit, and I'm going to wait until the phase is at its thinnest. Now reset my tuning while I've got almost complete phase cancellation. Now every time I press a key, you're going to get that sound. Now hear what happens when I play an octave. So we've got this really nasal C2. I'll play a whole octave. Different phase characteristics for each of the tones. This is absolutely fascinating stuff. I love all this. This is just analog synths being really cool. Reset our sound again, lock it to 0. Completely different set of tonal characteristics as I go up the octaves. None of this is bad. This is why analog synthesizers are so wonderful. The tuning control in the layer option is to allow you to detune oscillator 1 of the upper layer with oscillator 2 of the lower layer. Remember when we looked at the oscillators, VCO1 doesn't have an internal tuning control. So if we go back to standard double layer mode, and I'm going to engage just VCO1 for both layers. So now we can only hear, just make sure that my drift's at 0. Set my pan to 50%. So everything is completely flat. 65.41 on the nose. If I now detune one of those layers, I've basically created a tuning offset for VCO1. And now you can see and hear that pitch variance. Subtle is best, as always. Very tiny numbers make all of this stuff sound good. Bigger numbers make it sound dissonant. If that's what you want, awesome. But generally speaking, you want to add colour without necessarily detuning the thing. Now let's have a look at the assign section. This is all to do with how many notes we can play and what the synth does when we play one or more notes. By default, it's in polyphonic mode. Poly 1 is the standard polyphonic mode, and the maximum voices section tells you how many voices you have for this layer. So on each layer, we've got a different configurable number, so we could have 8 on the upper layer, 4 on the lower layer, and they're completely independent. If I set the maximum number of voices to 3 and play a 4 note, I'll play a very spread chord, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to play a very high note. You can't hear it. So this is a low note precedence polyphony. So you could basically hold like a bass note down, solo over the top of it, and you're never going to lose that bass note. We get different behavior when we switch to solo mode. This puts us in monophonic mode. Now, if I play basically the same 4-note chord, you're only ever going to hear 1 note at a time. I'm going to play the 4th note now. So in solo mode, you always hear the last note played. That's the very essence of a monophonic synthesizer. You always want to hear the last thing that you just played. In unison mode, it takes the total number of available voices and it stacks them as intelligently as it can. If you're still in polyphonic mode, which is really unusual for unison to have an option for you to also have polyphony, ordinarily with unison, every note, every voice gets stacked into a single note. That's not the case with that flashing light though. We've got polyphony here. We have a maximum of 3 voices. So I'm going to press one key. That's using 3 voices all to generate the same tone. Now, if I play a 3-note chord, there are only 3 voices available, so the synth distributes those voices as evenly as it can across those notes, and you basically get 1 voice per note again. Really interesting. If I press unison a second time, then the flashing light toggles over to solo, and this is more of a classical unison mode where all of the voices are always stacked into a single note. So I just played a 3-note chord there, you can see on the virtual keyboard, but only ever heard 1 note at a time, and it always used all 3 voices. Wherever you've got split options like this, you can see the unison mode has some lines drawn underneath it pointing to both the solo and the poly buttons. You basically just toggle the unison mode backwards and forwards to switch between those 2 options. I'm going to head back to solo mode, and now I'm going to jump across to glide. Before dealing with poly 2, I want to talk about glide first. So I'm going to engage portamento and turn the time button up to about 10 past. Now I'm going to play some notes on the keyboard. You can quite clearly hear that the notes are gliding from one to the next. It doesn't matter whether or not I've got a note pressed down or not when I press the next note. So now I'm going to play a high C. There's the portamento. I'll keep that C held down and play a new note. So basically, we don't need to play the notes what's called legato. In other words, hold one note down when you press the next. You're always going to get portamento between the different notes. Now this is glide in easy mode. When you've got solo engaged, glide is really easy to understand. If you engage polyphony though, this is a whole different ball game. What we've got now is every one of those voices, we've got 3 voices here, they've all got their own independent portamento control, and it makes it really difficult to track how you're supposed to slide from one note to the next. So if I hold that C down and play it repeatedly, the synthesizer is basically reusing the same voice over and over again, and that voice knows that it's supposed to be generating a C2. Now if I press a new note, we slide up from C to E. But now each time I press an E, I'm going to get that note. When I pressed that F, we went straight there. That was a total accident. It just so happened that the note that I pressed was one of the notes that was in memory. If I go up an octave, all of these notes are going to glide because none of the 3 voices that are attempting to generate that pitch currently have that note in memory. But the moment I press a note that is in memory, the synth remembers. It says, oh, you've done that's one of the notes in my memory bank, I'll use that again. In poly 2 mode that doesn't happen, and it will always do its best to glide from one note to the next. I'm playing a 4-note sequence here. 3 of those notes should be in the memory, but it doesn't matter. Poly 2 is basically tailored to making better use of the glide settings. So if you for some reason want polyphonic gliding, which is not a thing that I like at all, I only ever engage glide in monophonic mode, then poly 2 is your friend. Other than that, poly 1 is your standard go-to kind of typical voice management. Switch back to solo so that I can demonstrate gliss. Basically the same thing, but we're going to step up in semitones. And obviously if I make the time very slow, you really hear those escalator steps going up. You can have one of these on at a time, but not both. Now we can have a look at the arpeggio section. I'll turn portamento off. The arpeggio section in the Mercury-6 is basically another voice mode. So at the moment you can see that I'm in solo. The moment I click any of the arpeggio buttons, it's going to engage the arpeggio and disable all of the other options. So the synth makes your mind up for you. When you enter arpeggio, it says, well, I'm going to play arpeggios, just leave the voice control to me. Now if I play a 3-note chord, it's going to play those notes in ascending, repeating sequence. and it plays them at the rate governed by the rate knob. Obviously we can sync that to the host tempo as well, pretty straightforward. If I want to span over 2 octaves, pretty obvious, and down shouldn't really need explaining. Up and down, however, does, because when I press this button, one of the other lights starts flashing. So you can either go up then down, or down then up, and you get to those 2 options by multiple clicks of the UD button. So this is going to be up then down. I'm not going to demo the other one. It's pretty obvious what's going on. Random, totally that. Random's really cool with fast rates. I can't just press the random button again to disable the arpeggio. I need to select one of the other assignment modes. Let's switch back to solo, and we're in monophonic again. Pressing a chord, only hearing 1 note. Now I'm going to press the hold button and press 1 note. If I engage the arpeggio now and play a 3-note chord, so I'm not pressing the keyboard anymore. The last function for us to have a look at today is chord memory. This basically allows you to record multiple keys with a single key press, and the synth will remember all of the offsets of those notes. So if I engage it, the light will start to flash. It's now waiting for me to press keys. The moment I let all of the keys go, the light will turn off and it'll remember all of those intervals. Now, if you're inputting chord memories, try to play the notes sequentially. The first note that you press is basically going to be like the tonal anchor. So I'll play C, E, G, and then let all of the notes go. That C major chord is now in memory. So if I play a single C, there's the chord. Now I'll play an E, and it'll play the entire chord, but basically transposed 4 semitones. Just noticed I didn't talk about the util button, but it's really simple stuff. This is basically just how we manage transfer of layer information from one layer to another. So if I enter double layer mode and go into util, I can copy the upper layer to the lower layer or vice versa. This is all really straightforward stuff. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.